As Canadians, we have suddenly found ourselves next to a hostile and powerful neighbor. They have financial might, military supremacy, and cultural influence. However, Mark Carney has a card up his sleeve, and it's a doozy. I'm Steve Sandford, you're watching Dominion Report. Now, if you've watched my recent video about how empires fail, you'll know that I was suggesting that the US national debt is essentially a financial ticking time bomb. Carney pretty much has the fuse in one hand and a lighter in the other. Let me explain. The US has historically enjoyed a favorably low interest rate on their national debt, and that's because their currency has been the world's reserve currency for about 80 years. Like pretty much every empire before them, they took advantage of this low interest rate, not by simply enjoying lower interest rates, but by acquiring more debt. Now, their debt is threatening to spiral. You might have heard some Canadian politicians, ones who complain a lot, talk about how Canada's debt is spiraling. It's not. Take a peek at the G7 debt to GDP ratio. Now, don't let people talk to you about debt per capita statistics. We have a fairly small population in Canada, but we have a healthy GDP, so debt per capita is going to be misleading. Debt as a portion of GDP is a much more valuable stat and much more relevant. And you can see that the United States has a very high debt to GDP ratio. It's actually historically high. And at the moment, they're continuing to spend like teenagers with mom's credit card at the mall. This amount of debt leaves them vulnerable because if they ever had to pay even a slightly higher interest rate on their debt servicing, they could be financially crushed. And they would have to pay a higher rate if they ever lose status as the world's reserve currency. You're going to remember Carney's speech at Davos. That was about 2 weeks ago. Actually, it was 2 weeks ago. It seems like a lot longer. We thought that he was rallying the other mid-power countries to unify against the US trade threat. And he was. But actually, it was more than that because he was also talking about treasury bonds. A large portion of US treasury bonds are held by middle power countries, including Canada. We are the fifth largest holder, in fact. Earlier this year, Carney actually increased Canada's holdings in US Treasury bonds. Back in January 2025, it was 350 million US dollars, and now, a year and a bit later, it is 472 million. He didn't do this as a financial investment. He did it to prime the cannon. All Carney has to do is get together with a few of the other middle power countries, ones that have US Treasury bonds, approach the US with the united front, and threaten to start flooding the open market, selling off their US Treasury bonds. We kind of have them over a barrel. Because Canada, along with, let's just say, Japan, UK, and Belgium, for example, they could, in theory, absolutely tank the US economy. And I don't mean like a drop in the markets and a dip in their dollar. I'm talking about 1930 style depression, only worse. Because they would only have a few options. Issuing more treasury bonds at a much higher rate would consume a massive portion of their annual budget just to service that debt. That massive portion actually reduces the confidence that the world has in the US economy, which therefore makes the treasury bond less valuable, which makes the interest rate required to acquire them going to be much higher. And so that becomes a spiral that would consume a gigantic, an ever increasing amount of their annual budget. Pretty much they just run out of money. Now, they could just print more money, but that would probably cause hyperinflation. The kind of scenario where suddenly it would cost $1,000 for a loaf of bread, and by the next week it would cost $5,000 for that loaf of bread. Now, that kind of doomsday scenario is not going to be great for Canada, or frankly any country. Probably would cause a worldwide recession, if not a worldwide depression. So that's why this is kind of a nuclear option. It's because, taken to its extreme, it's sort of a mutually assured destruction type of scenario. However, for all the countries that it would affect, the US has the farthest to fall, and they would suffer the most. But given all that, the nuclear option doesn't have to be that extreme. The threat of a treasury bond crash is probably enough. just say that that's what you can do and that's what you would do. That's it. And if that isn't enough, a very small dip generated by a small but simultaneous multi-country sell-off would send a significant message. Now, again, I'm going to encourage you to watch my video about how empires end because it really fills in a bunch of missing context in this conversation. I actually believe that the US as an empire is pretty much doomed to end. And I think that the writing is already on the wall. So this worldwide depression scenario, it's possible it actually could just happen anyway. It might just be a matter of when. I'm convinced that the people currently running the White House, they know all this. And I think that it looks to me like they're just trying to grift as much as they can for as long as they can. And I'm not talking about Trump. Trump is colossally stupid, and there is no way he understands any of this. I'm talking about the people who are actually making the decisions. Those people are not going to be eager to encourage that huge market crash to happen anytime soon. They want to hold off as long as possible. And that's the leverage that Carney has. That is what he's got tucked up his sleeve. I'm really not sure how this is all going to pan out and what's going to happen next, but I will keep watching and I will keep reporting. And if you want to join me, be sure to subscribe.